Philip Carmichael had a habit of triple-checking the mirror before leaving, not out of vanity, but necessity. Every detail of his appearance had to be impeccable. The cut of his Armani suit, the gleam of his Italian shoes, the precise angle of the pocket square. That Friday night, as he adjusted his tie in the bedroom mirror, he could feel Hannah's gaze on his back. She sat on the bed, still in her bathrobe, watching him with that expression he had learned to ignore over the past 8 years of their marriage. "Dinner is at 8, he said, without turning, focused on taming a stray strand of hair. "I'll probably be back after midnight." "Of course," Hannah replied, her voice carrying a resignation that was no longer new. Philip finally turned, picking up his car keys from the dresser. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met hers, and he saw something he preferred not to decipher. Hannah was still beautiful, he couldn't deny that. At 36, she maintained the same natural look she had when they first met in Seattle before moving to Boston. Brown hair always pulled back in a simple bun, a face free of elaborate makeup, comfortable clothes she insisted were practical. It was precisely this simplicity that bothered him. "Are you going to say I'm sick again?" she asked, and there was something different in her voice. It wasn't hurt. Perhaps it was weariness. Philip hesitated at the doorway. "Richard will ask about you. He always does." "And what will you say? That I have a migraine? That I have a cold? Or will you invent something new this time?" He squeezed the keys in his hand until the metallic tips dug into his palm. "Hannah, we've already discussed this." "No, Philip, you've already decided this. There's a difference." During 8 years of marriage, Philip Carmichael built walls. Not the physical walls his architecture firm designed for Boston's wealthiest clients, but invisible barriers that separated his professional life from his personal one. On one side, there was the Philip who moved through the mirrored corridors of offices in the financial district, who closed million-dollar deals at dinners at No. 9 Park, who played golf with senators on Sundays at the Brookline Golf Club. On the other side, there was the Philip who returned home to Beacon Hill, to the Victorian brownstone they bought when the market was low, to the woman he had met in an art gallery in Seattle during a business trip that had changed his life in ways he had never imagined. The problem, in Philip's meticulously calculated perspective, was that Hannah didn't fit into the first side of the equation. She didn't wear the right clothes, didn't talk about the right things, didn't laugh at the right jokes. When he tried to explain the power dynamics at a corporate dinner, she would frown as if he were talking about quantum physics. When he tried to teach her about wines, she'd say they all tasted like fermented grape. Once, during an event at his partner's house, Hannah had commented that she found it pretentious to have 5 different forks for a meal. That had been the end of his patience. Since then, Philip developed a system. Weekday events. Hannah was busy with work. Business dinners. She had a prior engagement. Charity galas. She was indisposed. His collection of excuses became as refined as his collection of Hermes ties. The ironic thing was that Hannah never complained, at least not before. She simply accepted, turning to her books, her endless notes, her catalogues and photographs of artworks spread across the dining table. Philip never bothered much to ask about this work of hers. He knew it had something to do with art, some hobby she kept to occupy herself. It didn't pay much, he was sure, but it wasn't as if they needed the money. Now, standing at the threshold of the bedroom door, looking at the woman with whom he had shared a bed for almost a decade, Philip felt a creeping discomfort crawl up his spine. It was the same discomfort he felt when an architectural project didn't add up mathematically, when the numbers wouldn't align despite all calculations seemingly being correct. "I need to go," he said finally, his voice drier than he intended. Hannah didn't respond. She just picked up the book from the bedside table and opened it to a marked page. Philip recognized the cover, something about the authentication of Renaissance paintings, another one of her peculiar interests. He closed the door and descended the stairs with precise steps, echoing in the silent hallway. The house always seemed too big for two people. 5 bedrooms, 3 floors, an interior garden that Hannah insisted on maintaining herself, despite Philip having offered to hire a professional gardener multiple times. "I like to get my hands in the dirt," she would say, as if that were a virtue and not an embarrassing eccentricity. The Mercedes was parked in the private garage. Philip started the engine and drove out onto the streets of Beacon Hill, navigating the narrow streets lined with gas lamps that gave the neighborhood its historic charm. It was early October, and Boston was in that perfect moment between the summer heat and the intense winter cold. The trees were beginning to change color, dyeing the city in gold and crimson. Dinner was at Menton, a French restaurant where Philip had dined so many times that the maitre d' greeted him by his first name. As he drove, he mentally reviewed the guest list. Richard Ashford and his perpetually tanned wife, Gerald Morrison from the law firm that handled his contracts, Vanessa Chen, who had just closed a deal with the city council to develop the port area. They would all ask about Hannah. They would all receive the same vague answer, the same apologetic smile, the same promise that next time she'll definitely be there. Nobody questioned it. Why would they question it? In the bubble of Boston high society, absent wives were more common than Philip would care to admit. Some preferred their charity circles, others their Pilates classes and lunches with friends. Philip simply let them assume that Hannah was busy with similar activities. It was easier than admitting the truth, that he was ashamed of her. Shame was a strong word, he knew, but it was the only one that fit that tight knot he felt in his stomach whenever he imagined Hannah by his side at one of those events. He imagined her in her simple clothes among designer dresses, her unpolished nails next to impeccable French manicures, her sincere and unpretentious opinions amidst conversations carefully calibrated to impress and influence. She simply didn't belong in that world. And Philip had worked too hard, climbed too high, to let his marital choice compromise his position. Menton's parking lot was full. Philip handed the keys to the valet and adjusted his tie one last time before entering. The restaurant gleamed with that soft glow that only expensive lighting could provide. Crystals, polished wood, snow-white linen tablecloths. Richard was already there, waving from a table at the back. "Philip, I was starting to think you'd leave me alone with these sharks," Richard joked, shaking his hand firmly. "I'd never leave you at a disadvantage, Richard," Philip replied with the smile he had perfected over the years. Confident, but not arrogant. Friendly, but not overly intimate. "And Hannah? How is she?" The question came before Philip even sat down. You know how it is. She's involved in an important project at the moment. Work, he responded, picking up the menu despite already knowing what he would order. Richard nodded understandingly. "Figures. Speaking of projects, by the way, I need to discuss that ball with you." Philip looked up. "Ball?" "The annual Hartwell Foundation ball, next Saturday. You RSVP'd months ago, Philip." Of course. The Hartwell Foundation Ball, Boston's most exclusive event, held at the historic Hartwell Mansion in Back Bay. $2,000 a ticket, black tie mandatory, a guest list so exclusive that millionaire businessmen sometimes waited years for an invitation. The Hartwell Foundation Ball wasn't just a social event. It was a rite of passage for anyone aspiring to truly belong to Boston's elite. Philip had received his first invitation 3 years ago, shortly after closing the contract to design the new business complex on Boylston Street. Since then, he had become a regular guest, circulating among heirs to old fortunes and new tech magnates, all gathered beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Hartwell Mansion. "Of course I remember," Philip replied, taking a sip of water. "I've already set aside my tuxedo." "Excellent. This year promises to be particularly grand. Augustus Hartwell is celebrating the acquisition of a new art collection, something Renaissance, from what I hear." The old man is euphoric. Richard lowered his voice, leaning across the table. "Just between us, I heard he invested over 20 million in this collection, all authenticated by some renowned expert he brought in from God knows where." Philip nodded with moderate interest. Art had never been his forte. He appreciated aesthetics naturally. He was an architect after all. But that world of authentications, provenances, and obscure histories of ancient paintings always seemed overly complicated to him. Hannah could spend hours talking about brushstrokes and pigments. For Philip, a painting was either beautiful or it wasn't. Simple as that. "Augustus is obsessed," Richard continued. "He hired the best in the field. They say this person found 3 fakes in the collection he was about to buy, saved the old man from a monumental scandal." The conversation drifted to business, as always. Gerald Morrison arrived minutes later, followed by Vanessa Chen, in a black dress that probably cost more than an ordinary person's car. Dinner proceeded with the precision of a well-rehearsed play. Elaborate dishes presented as works of art, wine chosen by a sommelier who explained each note of flavor, conversations carefully woven between veiled compliments and subtle criticisms. Philip knew the steps of this dance well. He knew when to laugh, when to agree, when to express calculated concern. It was a game he mastered, unlike Hannah, who would always seem like a misplaced piece on that board. During dessert, Vanessa turned to him with a curious smile. "Philip, you're married, aren't you? How many years has it been now?" 8, he responded, maintaining a casual tone. "And we never see her at events. Is she shy?" Philip felt the familiar weight of the lie settle on his tongue. "Hannah is reserved. She prefers smaller, more intimate circles. You know how some people are." "What a shame. It would be lovely to meet her." Vanessa smiled, but her eyes carried that sharp curiosity, typical of someone who was always evaluating, cataloguing, judging. When Philip finally got home, it was past 1 in the morning. The house was silent, only a few dim lights illuminating the hallway. He went upstairs without a sound, a routine so practiced that his feet knew every creaking step. The bedroom door was ajar. Hannah was asleep, turned on her side, breathing softly and regularly. On the bedside table, Philip noticed a stack of documents and photographs. A momentary curiosity drew him closer. They were images of old paintings, notes in Italian and French in the margins, reports with museum stamps that he vaguely recognized. He frowned. Hannah always worked with these things, but Philip had never really paid attention. They were just papers, a hobby for someone with too much time on her hands. He picked up one of the photographs, a Madonna with child in shades of blue and gold. Beautiful, he silently admitted, but nothing that justified the hours Hannah spent poring over such documents. Philip put the photo back and went to the bathroom, the dinner conversation still echoing in his mind. The Hartwell Foundation ball. Another night he would need to invent an elaborate excuse for Hannah's absence. Another time he would circulate alone, keeping his 2 lives carefully separated. It was better this way, he convinced himself as he brushed his teeth. Simpler, less complicated. The following days passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls. Philip was closing a particularly complex contract for a new residential project in Cambridge, something that demanded his full attention. Hannah, as always, was a peripheral presence in his domestic life, someone with whom he shared space, but not necessarily time. She left early some mornings, returned late on others. Philip never asked where she went. He presumed they were engagements related to her artwork, perhaps visits to galleries or libraries. Hannah had mentioned something about a consultancy a few months ago, but Philip was in the middle of an important presentation and merely nodded with vague interest. On Thursday evening, 2 days before the ball, Philip was in his home office reviewing blueprints when Hannah entered with a cup of tea. "You'll need this," she said, placing the cup on the table. "It's almost 11. Philip accepted the tea with a murmur of thanks, his eyes still fixed on the drawings in front of him. Hannah remained there for a moment, and he could feel she wanted to say something. "Philip," she began. Her voice had that hesitant quality he had learned to recognize. "About the ball on Saturday." He looked up, meeting her gaze. Hannah was different somehow. Not physically, but there was something in her posture, a firmness that hadn't been there before. "Yes? You'll be going alone again." It wasn't a question. Philip sighed, leaning back in his chair. "Hannah, do we really need to have this conversation now? I'm in the middle of—" "I'm not asking to go," she interrupted him, and there was a clarity in her voice that made him stop. "I just wanted you to know that I'm aware of everything." Philip didn't know what to say. A dense silence filled the office, broken only by the ticking of the antique clock on the wall. "I love you, Philip," Hannah continued, and her words carried a weight he couldn't decipher. "I always have. But loving someone doesn't mean disappearing because of them." Before Philip could formulate a response, she had already left, leaving only the soft scent of her lavender soap in the air. On Friday, Philip picked up his tuxedo from the dry cleaners. The fabric was impeccable, creases perfect, buttons polished to a shine. He hung the suit in the closet, next to a collection of equally impeccable suits. As he closed the door, his eyes fell on Hannah's side of the wardrobe. Simple dresses, linen trousers, basic blouses. Nothing she could wear to a Hartwell Foundation ball. Nothing that wouldn't make her look out of place among the haute couture gowns he knew would be there. He was doing the right thing, Philip convinced himself. He was protecting them both. Hannah from a world that would judge her harshly, and himself from losing everything he had built. On Saturday, Philip spent the day in an inexplicable nervousness. He followed his usual routine: morning gym, light lunch, time to relax before getting ready. Hannah was quiet, busy somewhere in the house. He heard her on the phone a few times, speaking in English and then in Italian, her voice professional and focused. When it was time to dress, Philip was meticulous as always. The tuxedo fell perfectly on his shoulders, the black waistcoat contrasted with the starched white shirt, the bow tie was perfectly symmetrical. He looked at his reflection and saw exactly what he wanted to see: a successful, refined man who belonged. Hannah was not in the bedroom when he finished. Philip found her in the interior garden, kneeling near the rose bushes she insisted on cultivating. She wore jeans and a simple blouse with dirt under her nails. "I'm leaving," he announced from the doorway. Hannah turned, still kneeling, and for a moment their eyes met. There was something in that gaze that Philip couldn't name. It wasn't sadness, nor anger. It was something deeper, more final. "Have fun," she said simply, returning her attention to the roses. Philip felt that familiar discomfort creep up his spine again, but he ignored it. He had a ball to attend, people to impress, an image to maintain. The Hartwell mansion stood imposingly on Commonwealth Avenue, a relic of Boston's Gilded Age that seemed to defy time. Philip handed his invitation to the uniformed doorman at the entrance, ascending the marble steps that had been trod by generations of the city's influential families. Golden light streamed through the arched windows, and even from outside he could hear the refined murmur of the assembled elite. Inside, the main hall gleamed like a polished jewel. 3 crystal chandeliers hung from the ornate ceiling, each likely worth more than most houses in Boston. The walls were covered with dark mahogany panels, interspersed with gold-framed mirrors that multiplied the light and created the illusion of infinite space. Round tables covered with ivory silk tablecloths dotted the perimeter of the hall, leaving the center free for dancing. Philip accepted a flute of champagne from a passing waiter and allowed himself a moment to absorb the scene. He was here, again, among the chosen, among those who mattered. Men in impeccable tuxedos conversed in small groups, punctuating their words with restrained gestures. Women in dresses that cost fortunes circulated like elegant swans, authentic jewels shimmering at their necks and wrists. "Philip, you came!" Richard appeared beside him, already on his second or third glass, judging by the flush in his cheeks. "I've been looking for you. Come, you need to meet Augustus before he gets completely swarmed." Philip followed Richard through the crowd, greeting familiar faces with nods and brief smiles. Augustus Hartwell was near the main staircase, a man in his early 70s, with immaculately combed white hair and a tuxedo that was likely tailor-made in London. 3 people surrounded him, clearly hanging on his every word. "Augustus, this is Philip Carmichael, the architect I mentioned." Richard made the introductions with the ease of someone who had moved in those circles for decades. Augustus's hand was firm when he shook Philip's. His light blue eyes had that penetrating quality of someone accustomed to assessing people's worth in seconds. "Ah, yes. The Boylston Street project. Impressive work, young man. Clean, modern, yet respecting the surrounding historical architecture. Rare to find someone who understands that balance nowadays." "It's an honor to hear that from you, sir," Philip replied. And it was true. Augustus Hartwell wasn't just rich, he was practically Boston royalty. His family had roots tracing back to the colonists, and the Hartwell Foundation funded half of the city's cultural institutions. "I hear you're celebrating a new acquisition," Philip continued, showing polite interest. Augustus's face lit up in a way Philip had never seen in a man his age. It was almost childlike, pure, unfiltered joy. "Ah, yes, my Renaissance collection. 23 pieces, Philip. 23 authentic masterpieces from the 15th and 16th centuries. Caravaggio, Botticelli, even a small but absolutely perfect Raphael." He leaned in, lowering his voice as if sharing a state secret. "It cost a fortune, of course. But when you have something authentic, truly authentic, the price ceases to matter." "You must have been very careful with the authentication," Philip commented, remembering the conversation at dinner days before. "Careful?" Augustus let out a short laugh. "Boy, I was almost duped. I almost bought 4 masterfully executed fakes. It would have been the scandal of the century. Augustus Hartwell, renowned collector, paying millions for false works." He shook his head, still seeming disturbed by the possibility. "Lucky for me, I hired the best authentication consultant in the Western Hemisphere. She found every fake, traced the real provenance of each piece, saved my reputation and my collection." Philip took a sip of the champagne, only half listening as Augustus continued to talk about pigments and brushstroke techniques. Art had never been his world, but he knew the importance of showing interest when powerful men shared their passions. In fact, Augustus checked his pocket watch, an antique that likely belonged to his grandfather. "She should be arriving any moment now. I made a point of inviting her personally. She normally doesn't attend these events, says she prefers the company of centuries-dead paintings to living people." He chuckled at his own joke. "But I insisted. After the extraordinary work she did, she deserves to be celebrated." The conversation drifted to other topics, and Philip circulated through the hall, falling into the familiar rhythm of those interactions. He greeted Margaret Ashworth, a widow who donated millions to the Boston Symphony Orchestra. He discussed the real estate market with 2 developers who were eyeing properties in South End. He deftly avoided the conversational overtures of Catherine Whitmore, known for turning any dialogue into a veiled competition. It was almost 9 in the evening when Philip noticed a change in the energy of the hall. A murmur rippled through the crowd, heads turning towards the main entrance. He followed the gazes, curious as to who could cause such a reaction. Perhaps some celebrity or important politician. What he saw made the champagne flute almost slip from his fingers. Hannah stood at the top of the entrance staircase. But this wasn't the Hannah he had left kneeling in the garden hours ago, with dirt under her nails and faded jeans. This Hannah wore a midnight blue evening gown that seemed liquid in the way it caught the light. The cut was simple, elegant, falling in clean lines that enhanced her figure without ostentation. Her brown hair, usually pulled back in a practical bun, was loose in soft waves that framed her face. She wore subtle makeup that accentuated her eyes and made her skin luminous. But it wasn't the physical transformation that left Philip paralyzed. It was the way she moved. There was confidence in her steps as she descended the staircase, a natural grace he had never noticed before. And there was something more, something in how she held her head high, how her eyes scanned the hall, not with nervousness, but with the calm of someone who belonged. "My God, it's her!" Philip heard Augustus exclaim beside him, his voice filled with genuine pleasure. "I didn't think she'd actually come." Before Philip could process what was happening, Augustus was already crossing the hall towards Hannah, moving with surprising agility for a man his age. Philip watched, stunned, as the host of Boston's most exclusive ball greeted his wife with both hands, smiling as if she were visiting royalty. "Dr. Carmichael, it's an honor to have you here." Augustus's voice carried across the hall, causing several conversations to cease. "I thought I'd have to kidnap you from your catalogues and microscopes." Hannah laughed, and it was a sound Philip knew but had never heard in that tone. There was an ease to it, a comfort. "Mr. Hartwell, after everything we went through with that complicated Italian provenance, I thought it would be rude to refuse your invitation." "Complicated? My dear, it was a Kafkaesque nightmare, but you untangled every thread as if you were reading a children's book." Augustus turned to the crowd that was beginning to gather. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce Dr. Hannah Carmichael, the woman who saved my collection from becoming an international joke." Philip felt the world tilt beneath his feet. Dr. Carmichael? The authentication consultant Augustus couldn't stop praising was Hannah. His Hannah, whom he had assumed had merely an insignificant hobby with art. Margaret Ashworth was the first to approach, her eyes gleaming with interest. "Dr. Carmichael, I've heard of your work. You're the one who authenticated the Metropolitan's Baroque collection, aren't you?" "I've worked with the Met on a few projects." "Yes," Hannah replied with a genuine humility that, to Philip's astonishment, only seemed to heighten the interest around her. "And the Louvre?" Another voice joined in. "I read about a significant discovery involving a work erroneously attributed to one of the Flemish masters." "That was 3 years ago," Hannah confirmed. "We discovered it was actually by a talented apprentice, but the work had immense historical value for other reasons." Philip remained where he was, unable to move, as person after person approached Hannah. She knew all of them by name, not because Philip had introduced them, but because she had clearly already worked with many of them, consulting on their private collections, authenticating works for museums they sponsored. Vanessa Chen, who days earlier had asked why she never saw Philip's wife at events, now held Hannah's hand as if they were old friends. "You saved my uncle from buying that supposed Vermeer. He still talks about it. He said you spent 6 hours examining the canvas and then showed, with irrefutable evidence, that it was a 19th century forgery." "Vermeer is frequently forged," Hannah explained, and Philip could hear in that voice the same passion she displayed at home, poring over her catalogues and photographs that he had always ignored. He produced relatively few works in his lifetime, so every discovery of a new Vermeer is met with extreme skepticism in the academic community. Forgers know this and try to create convincing provenance stories. Gerald Morrison joined the group. "Dr. Carmichael, my firm handled a case involving your consultancy 2 years ago. A dispute over the authenticity of a collection in a divorce proceeding. Your report was so meticulous that the case was settled out of court." "I remember," Hannah smiled. "The husband was trying to hide assets by claiming certain works were worthless copies. The pigment analysis proved otherwise." Philip finally forced his legs to move, approaching the circle that had formed around Hannah. She saw him, and for a fraction of a second their eyes met. There was something in that gaze that made him stop. It wasn't triumph, nor anger. It was something softer, sadder. It was knowledge. Hannah knew exactly what he was feeling at that moment, and there was compassion in that knowledge. "Philip!" Augustus noticed him, beckoning him closer. "Come, come! Your wife is the hero of the night, and you've been hiding from her for too long." The circle opened to let him in, and Philip felt every pair of eyes on him as he positioned himself beside Hannah. She smelled different, some subtle perfume that he didn't recognize. Or perhaps she always wore that perfume, and he had never paid enough attention to notice. "I didn't know you would be here," he said low, just for her to hear. "I know," Hannah replied simply, her voice without accusation. "Augustus invited me 3 weeks ago. I didn't mention it because—" She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Because I thought it would be easier that way." Easier. The word echoed in Philip's mind. Easier for whom? For her, who wouldn't have to face his rejection. Or for him, who wouldn't have to confront the reality of what he had done. Augustus, blissfully unaware of the subtext, clapped his hands. "Well, now that everyone has reunited, we must toast. To art, to authenticity, and to the extraordinary people who ensure we can distinguish one from the other." Glasses were raised, and Philip mechanically lifted his own, watching Hannah being celebrated by the very people he had protected her from, or so he had thought. Now, under the crystalline light of the Hartwell Mansion's chandeliers, Philip began to realize an uncomfortable truth. He had never been protecting Hannah. He had been hiding her, ashamed of a woman whom those people already respected infinitely more than they respected him. The orchestra began to play, and couples moved to the center of the ballroom. Philip turned to Hannah, extending his hand in an automatic gesture. She looked at his hand for a long moment before accepting it, allowing him to guide her to the dance floor. Dancing with Hannah was both familiar and utterly strange. Philip knew the weight of her hand, the way she fit against his shoulder, but here, under the gazes of hundreds of people who clearly admired her, every movement seemed laden with meanings he couldn't decipher. The waltz was soft. The orchestra played something classical that Philip couldn't name, and couples spun around them like planets in orbit. "How long have you been doing this?" Philip finally asked, his voice low enough for only her to hear over the music. Hannah didn't need to ask what he meant. "Since before we met. It was my specialization in grad school. Then it turned into a master's, then a doctorate. You were on my thesis defense committee, remember?" Philip stopped dancing for a second, forcing himself to pick up the rhythm again when he noticed people were looking. "That was your thesis defense? I thought it was just a presentation." "It was my doctoral defense in art history with a specialization in Renaissance authentication techniques," Hannah corrected gently, without malice in her voice. "You said you had an important meeting right afterward, so you left before the committee's questions." The memory returned, fragmented. Philip vaguely recalled being in an auditorium in Seattle, Hannah in front of a screen, projecting images of ancient paintings, speaking with a passion he'd found charming at the time, but not important. He remembered checking his watch, whispering an excuse, and slipping out the side door. He never asked about the result. He just assumed she passed, because days later Hannah was excited, and he took that as confirmation enough. "You never told me you were a doctor," he protested, knowing even as he spoke how weak the defense was. "You never asked what you should call me," Hannah replied, and there was an old sadness in her words. "After a while, I stopped mentioning it. It seemed easier to let you think I had a hobby." The music changed, becoming slower, more melancholic. Philip pulled Hannah a little closer, a gesture that was part muscle memory, part desperation to maintain some connection with this woman who suddenly seemed a complete stranger. "Why did you never insist? Why didn't you force me to pay attention?" Hannah met his eyes, and Philip saw layers of pain there that he had never allowed himself to notice. "Because you made it very clear, Philip. Not with words, perhaps, but with every invented excuse, every event you excluded me from, every conversation about my work you diverted to talk about yours. You loved me, I know you did, but you were ashamed of who I was. And I loved you enough to let myself be hidden." "Hannah," Philip began, but he had no words to complete the thought. What could he say? That she was wrong? But she wasn't. Every unspoken accusation was true, and they both knew it. The music ended, and polite applause echoed through the ballroom. Before Philip could say anything more, Augustus reappeared, this time accompanied by a younger man in an impeccable suit carrying a leather briefcase. "Dr. Carmichael, forgive the interruption, but there's someone absolutely desperate to meet you. This is Marcus Way, from the Art Institute of Chicago. He flew specifically tonight, hoping to find you here." Marcus extended his hand with barely contained enthusiasm. "Dr. Carmichael, it's an honor. We have a delicate situation involving a potential acquisition, a series of late Gothic frescoes. The provenance is questionable, and our board has refused to approve the purchase without external consultation. Your name was mentioned unanimously." Hannah shook his hand with warm professionalism. "The Chicago Institute has one of the most respected conservation departments in the world, Mr. Way. I'm sure your own team would be more than capable." "They would be, under normal circumstances, but this potential acquisition involves $22 million and the reputation of our largest donors. We need someone whose word is indisputable." Marcus opened his briefcase, revealing photographs of fragments of paintings on ancient walls. "Supposedly from Simone Martini's workshop, but there are inconsistencies in the documentation that concern us." Philip watched Hannah lean over the photographs, her eyes scanning every detail with an intensity he recognized from other contexts, from mornings when he found her at the dining table surrounded by documents, from nights when she stayed up late with a magnifying glass over some image. He had always thought it eccentric obsession. It had never occurred to him that it was world-class expertise. "These marks here," Hannah pointed to something in the photographs Philip couldn't even make out. "This sequence of brushstrokes in the halo of the central figure. Martini had a very specific technical signature in how he applied gold leaf over gesso. But I would need to see the pieces personally, do pigment analysis, check the composition of the underlying plaster." "Naturally. Could we have you in Chicago next week? All expenses paid, of course, in addition to your usual consulting fee." Hannah hesitated, her eyes briefly meeting Philip's before returning to Marcus. "Can I confirm by Tuesday? I need to check my schedule." Of course. Here's my card. Please call any time." Marcus practically beamed with relief as he handed Hannah the card. Other people approached as Marcus stepped away. A curator from the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, wanting to discuss a lecture Hannah had agreed to give. A private collector from New York, asking if she would be available to appraise a collection he had recently inherited. A journalist from Art and Antiques magazine, requesting an interview about modern methods of forgery detection. Philip remained by Hannah's side through each interaction, a silent spectator to what was clearly her real life. The life she lived when he was in his meetings and dinners, when he was building his reputation among architects and developers. Hannah had built something entirely her own, something that didn't depend on him, that didn't need him, that existed on a plane completely separate from the reality he had carefully cultivated. When there was finally a lull in the constant flow of people, Philip touched Hannah's elbow. "Can we talk? In private?" She nodded, allowing him to guide her to one of the balconies overlooking the illuminated gardens of Hartwell Manor. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and summer's last breaths. Lanterns hung from century-old trees, casting dancing shadows over the stone paths below. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Philip rested his hands on the iron railing, looking out at the garden without truly seeing it. His world was reorganizing piece by piece, and he no longer knew where he fit into the puzzle. "Why did you come tonight?" he finally asked. "You could have refused Augustus's invitation. You could have spared me this humiliation," Hannah completed, her voice too gentle for the word she had chosen. "I didn't come to humiliate you, Philip. I came because Augustus insisted, and because I got tired of making my life smaller to fit into the box you built for me." Philip turned to face her, and in the soft light of the lanterns, Hannah seemed at once the woman he had married and someone entirely new. "I didn't know. You have to believe that. I genuinely didn't understand what you did, the importance of it." "You didn't know because you chose not to know," Hannah replied, and there was no anger in her voice, just a weary clarity. "I showed you my projects, Philip. I mentioned the consultancies, the museums I worked with. You nodded, mumbled something about it being nice, and changed the subject every single time." Philip couldn't deny it. Memories flooded back, sharp now that he was paying attention. Hannah excitedly recounting authenticating a piece for the Getty Museum. He had said, "That's great, honey," while checking emails on his phone. Hannah mentioning a trip to Florence to consult Vatican archives. He had complained that she'd be away during an important dinner he wanted to host. Hannah trying to explain a significant discovery about medieval pigmentation techniques. He had yawned and said he was tired. "I messed it all up, didn't I?" The words came out almost as a whisper. Hannah moved closer to the railing, standing beside him but not touching, maintaining that space which suddenly felt like an abyss. "You didn't mess it all up. You just prioritized your shame over our marriage. And I allowed you to do that because I was afraid of losing you if I forced you to choose." "But why were you ashamed of me?" Philip turned to her, and there was a vulnerability in his voice he rarely allowed. "Look at you, Hannah. You're brilliant. Respected, sought after by institutions all over the world. Why would someone like you marry someone like me and then agree to be hidden?" Hannah laughed, but it was a sad sound. "Because when we first met, you made me feel seen. You walked into that gallery in Seattle, and while everyone else looked at the paintings, you looked at me. You asked me what I thought of the exhibition. You actually listened when I answered. You made me feel like I mattered, not my knowledge or expertise, but me as a person." She paused, her eyes shining suspiciously under the lantern light. "I only realized later that it was because you didn't yet see me as part of your professional world. I was separate, private, yours. And when you realized my work might overlap with your social circle, you started to hide me." Philip felt something break inside him, some carefully constructed framework of denial and justification. "I was afraid," he admitted, the words torn from a place he rarely visited. "Afraid that you would be more impressive than me, that people would realize I was lucky to be with you and not the other way around. Afraid of losing control of this narrative I had built about who I was and where I belonged." "And now?" Hannah asked softly. "What happens now that your worst fantasy has come true?" now that everyone in that ballroom knows exactly who I am." Philip looked back into the ballroom, where through the glass doors he could see the dance continuing. He saw people circulating, talking, laughing. He saw the world he had fought so hard to conquer, and for the first time he questioned if it was worth the price he had paid. "Honestly, I don't know, but I know I don't want that life anymore if it means not truly having you in it." Hannah remained silent for a long moment, and Philip could feel the weight of years of hurt and neglect hanging between them like a physical presence. When she finally spoke, her voice was careful, measured. "Philip, you saying this here now, after being forced to see who I really am, doesn't erase 8 years of making me feel like I wasn't enough. It doesn't undo every lie you told about where I was, every event you excluded me from, every time you chose your image over our reality." "I know," Philip said miserably. "I know. And I have no excuse that makes it right. But I can change. I can be better." "Can you?" Hannah turned to face him completely, and there was a strength in her posture that Philip had never noticed before, or perhaps it had always been there, and he simply hadn't paid enough attention. "Because on Monday, when you go to you,